I have right here the most popular bridge cameras, super zoom cameras, point and shoot cameras, whatever you want to call them, they're all here. These are the ones you want to consider if you want a bridge camera right now. And you know, it's not so easy to find one because manufacturers are discontinuing them left and right. Yeah, there's a new model here and there, but for the most part, they're on their way down, despite the fact that we know and love them. Now, this is a long, detailed 30-minute plus video, but stick with it because in this video, I'll announce the Bridge Camera Awards, the best of the best. Some ground rules. We're not going to be looking at the small point-and-shoot compact cameras. That'll be in another video. This video will be more of the full-size cameras. They have to have a viewfinder, and no, we're not going to look at the cheap knockoff brands from China. So here are all the models that we are comparing. Starting with Panasonic, the FC80D, the FC2500, the FC300, in the Nikons, the P950, the P1000, the Sony RX10 Mark IV, and the HX400V, the Canon SX70, and we're also going to talk about some related cameras in this lineup, so there'll be some surprises. So let's talk about for a second what they all have in common. They all have a built-in flash, which is a very nice feature. They can all close focus or do near macro photography. They can all shoot in 4K video except one model. And the maximum frame rate of that 4K video is 30 frames per second. Unfortunately, none of these can do 60 frames per second. They all have older autofocus systems, contrast-based systems, except one of the models. And with the exception of just two of these models, they all have small sensors. So in order to best compare them, we're going to organize these cameras by category. So let's talk about the king of the super zooms. We'll start at the top, the Nikons, the Nikon P1000 and the Nikon P950. The Nikon P1000 almost has like cult status. It goes out to 3,000 millimeters, which is really almost like a telescope. And matter of fact, some people do use it for that purpose. But it's really popular with birders and those that shoot wildlife for obvious reasons because of its incredible zoom range. But it isn't even limited to that. It starts out at a wide 24 millimeters, so you really can use it in so many applications without ever having to change a lens. The problem is, you may already know, it's been discontinued for a while now. There are rumors that Nikon is going to replace it. I have been following that. There is supposedly some news that's going to be released within the next few months, I'm hoping, and I will be sure to tell you as soon as I hear anything. But for now, if you want this camera, you have to buy it secondhand. Now, the P1000 and the P950, they are very similar, as I mentioned, but there are some important differences. The biggest difference, well, there's a couple of big differences. The biggest is the size and weight. The Nikon P1000 is about 40% heavier, and it's bigger in just about every dimension. And you really can see the difference and feel the difference, especially if you're going to be carrying it around all day. The P1000 is going to get kind of cumbersome. And the reason it's bigger and heavier, obviously, is because of that 125 times zoom versus 83 times zoom. Now, is that extra 1,000 millimeters worth it? I was surprised because I did a test in a prior video when I reviewed the P950 to see the difference, and it was kind of less than I thought. They have the same sensor. They both have a 16 megapixel, 1/2.3 inch small sensor. So image quality, virtually the same. There is a slight aperture difference. At full zoom on the 950 is f6.5, and at full zoom on the P1000 it's f8. But realize at 3,000 millimeters it's f8, and at 2,000 millimeters it's f6.5. At 2,000 millimeters on the P1000 it's also around f6.5. So it's not a true advantage. It's only because the P1000 goes out a lot further and slows down. Now, the P950 was released after the P1000, so a few things have been updated a little bit. There's a little better burst rate, not very significant, but the autofocus system has been updated. There's a few more autofocus modes, and because the glass isn't as big, some people have reported when doing birding that they find the focus to be a little snappier. Now, speaking of focus, on the P1000, if you're going to manually focus, you have a front ring that does that. On the P950, there is a little wheel on the side. It's a little more awkward to use for focusing. By the way, I have an entire tutorial series on the P950, and one of them is on focusing in case you want to watch that. Both can close focus from about 0.4 inches from the lens. Both have really nice articulating 3.2-inch screens and really sharp 2.36 million dot viewfinders. Both have mic inputs. Look how long this comes out. That's what she said.
You think that's funny?
Now, if you're shooting outside, the brightness of the P950 screen is slightly brighter than the P1000s. As far as price goes, about $800 US for the P950, and the P1000 on the secondhand market is $1,000 or more. Look, someone paid about $2,300 new from Japan. Another small advantage of the P950 is you get a few more shots per battery charge, 290 versus 250, but with either camera, battery life isn't great. I always recommend carry plenty of extra batteries. They're cheap enough, small enough, especially compared to the size of these cameras. Now, the model before the P950, the P900 was a very popular model, and let me just briefly touch on that in case you're interested in saving a few dollars and seeing what the difference is. The P900, same sensor, same aperture, but it does not shoot RAW. There is no 4K video, it's only 1080p. There is no flash hot shoe. The 900 is slightly lighter than the P950, and it also had built-in GPS, which is dropped, by the way, with the P950 and P1000. The P950 also greatly improved the viewfinder resolution from the P900. Now, another important difference between the P1000 and P950, and if you're caught in the Amazon rainforest, you may want to know that the P1000 is not weather sealed, unfortunately. The P950 has more seals for dust and moisture. You're much safer with the P950 than you are with the P1000, something to keep in mind. Let me tell you my thoughts on these two cameras. They both really are incredibly versatile. Even at wide angle, these take really nice, sharp, contrasty pictures. The issue is when you zoom up, it's often hard to get a good picture, especially on the P1000, because you really are like a telescope. Every little movement is magnified. So the hit rate for success at 3,000 millimeters is going to be harder than at 2,000 millimeters, even if you're on a tripod, because even a slight wind will move the tripod a little bit. So you have to get a really steady tripod. So just be realistic about it. But what I will tell you on both of these cameras, there's great image stabilization. It's surprising. I can hand hold both of them at full zoom. Now there is going to be some shake, but I was surprised how well it did, especially compared to some of these other cameras when we talk about their stabilizations. The biggest frustration with both these cameras is the autofocus. You think you're locked on to a bird and then it just loses it. I've tried different autofocus modes. I mean, you can experiment yourself. Maybe one of you guys have tried an autofocus mode. Some people say use sports mode. I don't know. I find it to be frustrating, and it's hard using manual focus when you're, photographing wildlife or a bird, because you really got to be quick about it too. So you really would like autofocus to work. Don't use the Nikons at night. They're really not designed for that. If you're doing wildlife and birding predominantly, well, then you really have to consider the Nikons, because the picture quality is great. You can even get some nice background blur because of the super long zoom despite the small sensor. And what I would say about deciding between the P950 and the P1000, if you're not going to be carrying the camera around much, if you're just going to be transporting it from your car, van, or Jeep and having it on a heavy-duty tripod, then the weight isn't that much of an issue. But if you're considering using the camera as maybe to travel with, or more for everyday events, or you're going to be outside with it carrying around, then to me the P950 really is the winner, because it's more versatile. You can really use it as an everyday camera. It's not overwhelmingly heavy. It's not that cumbersome. And the 2,000 millimeters is a shockingly good zoom. So just keep in mind, this is what long zooms look like on a full frame camera. You don't have that with the Nikons. If your primary use is astrophotography, well then maybe the P1000 is a better choice to get in a little tighter on the planets. This is a 4K video I took of Jupiter a couple of years ago. So the strengths and weaknesses, the longest zooms are the P950 and P1000, and really good stabilization considering how long the zooms are. Even though it's a small sensor, they take good pictures, and there's also time-lapse and other cool effects, good screen quality. But the cameras are heavy, especially compared to the other ones we're reviewing. The focus does hunt, They do have Wi-Fi, but it's kind of buggy. And they're only 16 megapixel sensors, so if you like to crop in, you're going to be a bit limited with that. The second category are the small sensor cameras that are a great value, that start out really wide and go out to a really long zoom. And those cameras are the Canon SX70, the Panasonic FC80D, the Panasonic FC300. And the last model in that group is a really old camera, more than 10 years old, the Sony HX400V. I'm including this camera because I did review it and I was really impressed with it. And despite the fact that it's really old, I think it should be strongly considered for that category. Now, compared to the P1000, for example, this category of cameras is way smaller and lighter. They're perfect for travel, for family events, to shoot your kids' sports games or grandkids' basketball or soccer games. They're all-purpose cameras, and they also have long zooms and can still be used quite effectively for wildlife and birding. So, what's going on? What about these cameras over the Nikons? The zooms are not nearly as long, but on a couple of the cameras, they are even wider. The Panasonic FC80D and Canon SX70, 20 and 21 millimeter wide angle. That's quite a bit wider than 24 on the Nikons, but just realize that's for photos. Both cameras have a bit of a crop. The Canon especially has a heavy crop, and you completely lose any wide angle on the Canon SX70 in 4K video especially, and that's the biggest disadvantage of the Canon, is that crop. It's really an incredible zoom on these, going from around 20 millimeters up to 1200 on the Panasonic. But notice the grain here in the Canon zoom. That's because it's a low light scene and there's a small sensor. So on B&H Photo Site, the Panasonic's a top wish, the Canon's a top gift. Which one do you get?
I wish to make gift.
I pitted these cameras up in a recent video, side by side, but I'll summarize it here in this video. Picture quality is pretty comparable on both, but there are some important differences. The stabilization on the Canon is surprisingly bad. So if you're going to be using this for video, the SX70, you're going to get much shakier footage than you do on the FC80D. Now, the stabilization on the FC80D is not perfect. There is a bit of a wobble that you'll see, like a rolling shutter type of effect. It is a great budget camera. It is the newest camera in the group, sort of.
Well, kind of.
It's actually just a refresh of an older model, the FC80. They just added a couple of extra ports. It's basically an older camera that's just been re-released, but that's okay. I'll take that over just killing the line off altogether. But a few things that bother me about the FC80D, the biggest thing is that the rear screen is fixed. It doesn't tilt, it doesn't articulate, and in today's day and age, that is annoying. I mean, that's one of the big advantages we're supposed to have over a cell phone is an articulating screen so we can get creative in our angles. And to make matters worse, between using the viewfinder and the screen, you have to press a hard button to go from one to the other. All these other cameras have eye sensors and can tell when your eye is up against the viewfinder. It'll blank out the rear screen and automatically activate the viewfinder. Well, not in this one. Another quirk, which is a little strange on this camera, is that when you're zooming, you'll occasionally hear like a strange echoey sound. There is no mic jack, and they also dropped Wi-Fi from this model, which is weird because the model, the original FC80, had Wi-Fi. And this is why I say, depending on what your needs are, a particular camera might be ruled out or not. For some people, they don't care about Wi-Fi transfer. They just pop the SD card into their computer. But for others, if that's an issue, just be aware there is no Wi-Fi in this camera. So in summary, it is a great value, under $500. You get a tremendous wide angle, tremendous zoom with good pictures, and there are a lot of bells and whistles. But there's no free lunch. The rear screen is fixed. There's no Wi-Fi, no mic jack. The stabilization is a bit wobbly. You have that echo sound when zooming, and there's no eye sensor. The Canon does have Wi-Fi. The Canon does have a mic jack. Doesn't have a headphone jack, and it doesn't have a hot shoe on which to attach a mic, but you'd have to use a sort of like a rig coming out of the tripod socket to do that. The Canon is a great all-around camera. I spent a lot of time with it. I have a lot of videos on it. It's a nice size. It feels good in the hands. The viewfinder is nice and clear. The screen fully articulates, unlike the Panasonic. The zoom is incredible. It does have that wide angle and that really nice tight zoom. The picture quality is very good. Again, the stabilization is an issue. It's a small sensor, so it will get grainy in low light, just like the Panasonic. It's nice and small, feels good in the hands, great for traveling and just carrying around. If you're familiar with the Canon menu system, it's very easy to understand. Again, it will get grainy, as it's showing here, as the ISO ramps up. And it's not really fair to call it a point and shoot because it does time lapse and it has a lot of other cool effects that it can do, like sort of like live photo, like an iPhone can do. Check out my other videos if you want to learn more on those. So the pros, it's a good size and weight, great zoom range. It has lots of features. It has a mic jack, articulating screen, and represents an excellent value. Stabilization is poor, heavy crop in 4K, and it's too bad it doesn't have a hot shoe or a headphone jack to go with that mic jack. The third camera in this category is the HX400V by Sony, the older camera I was telling you about. Very similar zoom range to the Canon and Panasonic, 24 millimeters to 1200 millimeters. So about the same size. Couple of key differences though. This screen doesn't fully articulate, it just tilts. And if you're into photography, some people find that to be more preferable. And despite the fact that the camera is old, it has a Zeiss lens, and that never gets old. It takes some really nice, sharp shots. There's a switch on the lens. You can control the ring either as a zoom or focus, and you can go into manual focus that way. So that's a nice touch. It does have a hot shoe. Another thing that this has is built-in GPS. It's the only one of these cameras that has built-in GPS, and some people I know really miss that. The biggest limitation I found is the viewfinder. It's really small, the resolution is really low, and even in bright sunlight, sometimes it's hard just to shield your eye from the sun. It's just not a great viewfinder experience. I'm glad it has it, but it's definitely the biggest weakness of this camera. It also, if you're a video shooter, no 4K video. You're limited to 1080p 60. You'd have to buy it used, but you can get it at a very reasonable price. Comparable zoom range to the FC80D and Canon SX70. And even though it's an older autofocus system, I found it to be pretty good. So the HX400V is another great value with a great zoom range and a surprisingly good image with a Zeiss lens. That's probably the reason. It's lightweight, built-in GPS, but a low-res viewfinder, no 4K, no RAW, no mic jack. So it's an older camera. It's not going to have a lot of the newer features, older menus, and no Wi-Fi. Now, I can't talk about every bridge camera that ever existed, but since we just talked about the 400, this is the HX100V, an earlier version of that camera. The zoom isn't quite as long as the 400, but it's very similar. Also takes some very good images. You can get it even cheaper. This is the HV. I can never get it right. I'm sorry. It's the HX100V, under $200 on Amazon. So the fourth camera in this second category of cameras that we're reviewing is the Panasonic FC300, possibly the most unique camera of all of them. Now, why do I say that? It sort of looks like the rest of them. Well, this goes out from 25 millimeters to 600 millimeter zoom, so just a millimeter short of that 24 millimeter wide, and 600 millimeters, which is still pretty good, but not quite as long as the 1200 millimeters and 1365, which we saw with the Canon. So why would you consider this? Because this has a constant f2.8 aperture throughout the entire zoom range. That is pretty impressive. It is a small sensor, but still f2.8 means that you can use this in much lower light situations and get acceptable results. Whereas with these other smaller sensor cameras, they really do fall apart at night or in a dark room. And the FC300 will stand up a lot better. Another unique thing about the FC300 is that it has a 12 megapixel sensor. Sounds small, right? But don't let that scare you. That means the photo sites can actually be larger, so they can capture more light into that small sensor. Now, the disadvantage is at 12 megapixels, you can't crop in as much. So if you're doing a lot of cropping on your pictures, maybe this isn't the camera for you. But what a great camera for every day. You can take this with you. For traveling, it's incredible because of the ability to shoot in lower light. You're not going to be restricted. If it gets dark early and you're caught with your camera, you can still use it. Of course, there is a built-in flash in the camera as well, which is very nice. So Panasonic likes to throw in a lot of features with their cameras, and this is no exception. It's got a mic jack, it has Wi-Fi, it has a micro HDMI port. So really, it's incredible that they crammed all this into a pretty small camera. And you can get a great deal on it now because you can only buy it used. 4K 30 video, there is time-lapse, focus stacking. You can do a lot with this camera. Again, I have a full review on it if you want to check it out. So obviously the trade-off is you get about half the zoom range as you do with the other cameras in this category. So you have to decide. 600 millimeters is still plenty. You can get in really tight. And what's nice about this camera is that you really, when you zoom in, you don't get the drop off in picture quality and sharpness that you do on some of the other cameras. Now granted, you're only going out to 600 millimeters, so maybe that's part of the reason, but it really stays consistent throughout the range of the zoom. In one of my videos, I actually pitted this camera up, the FZ300, against the RX10 Mark IV, a much more expensive, larger sensor camera, which we'll get to in a moment, and also a Micro Four Thirds Panasonic camera, and it really held its own. It was hard to tell the difference. This camera really, I wouldn't hesitate to take out with me. I wouldn't hesitate to travel with it. I've already done that because it's so nice and light and so versatile. They also made the FZ300 dust and splash and weather resistant, as opposed to the Canon, Panasonic, and Sony in this category, which are not. So that'll give you peace of mind as well. One of the biggest negatives, again, just like with the Nikons, is the autofocus. It does tend to hunt. I wish Panasonic would update it, but I don't want to sound like a broken record. That's going to be your biggest negative with the FZ300, is the same sort of quirky autofocus system. Again, that may bother you more in video when it sort of loses the focus when you're locked onto something. So the constant f2.8 aperture across the zoom range makes this so unique, yet it has a lot of other bells and whistles, an articulating screen, it's water and dust resistant, and takes great pictures, but it's a smaller sensor, so you can't crop in as much. The zoom isn't as long as the others, autofocus isn't great, and the EVF is, some of the other cameras have better EVFs. Now the prior model to the FZ300, in case you're interested, was the FZ200, and they upgraded a lot of features from the 200. This is the days when manufacturers actually made improvements to their cameras. They upgraded the EVF and the rear screen. They added a mic jack to the FZ300. They added Wi-Fi to the FZ300. But if you don't really care about that and you want to save a few dollars, the FZ200 may be an option for you too, because they'll produce very similar results. The third and final category in the bridge camera review comparison are the 1-inch semi-professional / professional bridge cameras. True bridge cameras that go between a point and shoot experience, all in one camera, to the quality now is approaching DSLR or mirrorless cameras. So that's where the term bridge camera came from. We have two contenders, the Sony RX10 Mark IV and the Panasonic FZ2500. Both are excellent cameras with outstanding features and professional touches. The professional touches on the RX10 Mark IV, more towards photography. This got a clickable aperture ring. Also has a top LCD display so you could check your photography settings like shutter speed, f-stop. It has a tiltable rear screen, not an articulating rear screen, which the FZ2500 has. It has a focus limiter, and it has focal length designations on the lens barrel itself. The FZ2500 has some nice touches of its own. It has a built-in neutral density filter that works both in photos and in video. And speaking of video, it has a lot of video-centric features like 4K DCI and a lot more video codecs, and you can really fine-tune your video. Still only 4K 30, but it has better slow motion than the RX10 Mark IV, which built-in slow motion is really horrible. It has to buffer. You can only record a few seconds. You're much better off recording at 120 frames per second in HD. But the big advantage that the FZ2500 has over the RX10 Mark IV in video is no 30-minute recording limit. As a matter of fact, this is the only camera in the lineup which allows you to record video continuously without having to stop and start after 29 or 30 minutes. And this is important if you're doing event video work, semi-professional, professional work, where that could be an issue. Imagine in the middle of a wedding ceremony and the camera stops and you miss that crucial I do moment and you have to restart and you missed that second or two. They have HDMI out. You can get clean HDMI out. You can use these for live streaming. And they both have mic and headphone jacks. Now the Sony Zoom is a little longer. It's 600 millimeters versus 480, so you do get that advantage. But in video, since the FZ2500 has a heavier crop in 4K, it evens it up a bit. So in video, you lose a little wide angle on the FZ2500, but you gain it back on the zoom end. Another important difference between the two cameras is the 2500's lens is always extended as if you're fully zoomed. Now, the advantage of this is it's supposed to seal out dust better. Personally, I have never had a problem with the RX10 Mark IV getting dust into my sensor. At least I haven't noticed it. But that design that the 2500 uses is supposedly better for that. I would say the downside is that the lens is constantly at full extension, so you're going to be less discreet, especially if you're doing something like street photography. The RX10 Mark IV doesn't have as many bells and whistles as the 2500 does. It doesn't even have a touchscreen, the RX10 Mark IV, although you can touch to focus on the rear screen, but that's about it. The 2500 has that touchscreen. It also, again, has a lot of the Panasonic features like slow motion, special zoom mode, special panning modes, the post-focus mode, time-lapse. If you want a lot of features, the 2500 gives you more bang for the buck than the RX10 Mark IV. But the RX10 Mark IV has that Zeiss lens, and in my testing, it is cream of the crop. Image quality on photos, if you're comparing the RX10 Mark IV versus the 2500, in my opinion, in my testing, and feel free to watch the video, seems to do somewhat better than the FZ2500. I believe it's a sharper lens, it's a more consistent lens, it exposes better, it seems to interpolate when you're in auto mode to get a better shutter speed. Sometimes the shutter speed on the FZ2500, to me, it doesn't seem right. Some of my shots came out blurry, slightly overexposed. The RX10 Mark IV just seems to nail it better. The difference isn't so apparent in video though. The 2500 does a great job in video, especially when you have all those video codecs. The biggest problem with the 2500 is the autofocus again. It does tend to hunt, and I found it even hunted outside in bright light in video. Unlike the RX10 Mark IV, which uses the phase detect latest technology, well, it's not the absolute latest technology, but it is a superior autofocus system. And you can see in this example, there is no hunting, even though there's a lot of opportunity for distractions. Stays focused on this singer's face. But I think the stabilization on the RX10 Mark IV is about 2 or 3 generations behind where we are currently today. It's still a little jittery, and it's just not great. The FZ2500 has a bit of an edge in the stabilization department. But because of the 1-inch sensor, both will do a lot better than these other models in low light. You're going to get a much brighter image and a much less grainy image, and my testing did confirm that. But the RX10 Mark IV is nearly double the price of the FZ2500. Is it worth it? But let's see, the 2500 has that neutral density filter, really great video features. It has the large 1-inch sensor. It has an articulating screen versus a tilt screen, and there's no record limit. Now, the lens doesn't retract. That's a pro and a minus, depending on what you want. The zoom is not quite as strong as the RX10. The autofocus hunts, and it's a bit heavier than some of the other super zooms. Now, the RX10 Mark IV has a top-class picture with a very professional layout of the camera, like that aperture ring, a 1-inch sensor, great autofocus, and a pretty fast lens considering f2.4 to 4, which is very similar to the FZ2500. Both have side-loading SD card slots. The RX10 Mark IV doesn't have great stabilization, no touchscreen, uses the older Sony menus, not great slow motion, and it's heavier and much more expensive than the other super zooms that we're reviewing. I will talk about another model which is very similar to the 2500 that was, a matter of fact, just recently discontinued, yet another model discontinued. It's the FC1000 Mark II. Looks very similar to the 2500, but some important differences. If you're interested in that, you could save a few dollars, but here's what you'll be giving up. The zoom on that model only goes out to 400 millimeters. The 2500 goes out to 480. The FC1000 Mark II does not have a neutral density filter. The Mark II does have a touchscreen, but it doesn't have all the video codecs and video features that the FC2500 has. The other big difference, and you may not like this about the FC1000 Mark II, is the recording limit. Unlike the 2500, which eliminates a 30-minute recording limit, the FC1000 Mark II does have a 30-minute recording limit in 4K, but depending on the format you're shooting in, you may not have a recording limit. It's confusing. I have on screen how it breaks down. If you want to save some money, it's also a little lighter, the FC1000 Mark II, so that might be an option for you. Leica introduced the Velux 5 in 2019. It's just a rebranded FC1000 Mark II, but you spend more money for the Leica name. Let's say you like the RX10 series, but you wanted to go cheaper. You can get an older version of the RX10 Mark IV. As a matter of fact, I had the original one. And here are some shots I took. They look surprisingly good, right? Even she can't believe how good they look. So the original RX10 is definitely a contender too. And that model's lens went from 24 to only 200 millimeters, but it had a fixed f2.8 lens. It wasn't until 2016 with the RX10 Mark III that the lens went from 24 to 600 millimeters with a variable aperture. And here are some shots from 2016 I took with the Mark III. Still an excellent camera if you're interested in an earlier version of this camera. The entire series did a great job of taking pictures and video. Here we are up to the Mark IV, and there's speculation, will there be a Mark V? And now the moment you've all been waiting for as we announce the winners for the best bridge cameras. And for the category of birding and wildlife, it's going to go to the P950 because it's the most versatile camera to use with a great 2000 millimeter zoom. Best performance for the dollar, the FC300 taking great pictures with that constant f2.8 lens. For best video, the envelope please, the FC2500 has the best video features. And the award for the most unique, if you need to really be like a telescope, if you're doing astrophotography, aviation photography, if you're a spy, the Nikon P1000. But the best overall performing camera is the Sony RX10 Mark IV, which just takes the best picture and the most professional design. Now, I've gotten a lot of comments on my channel. Why can't they do this in an APS-C camera with this kind of zoom range? I'd buy it in a second. They can't. Physics won't allow it. If you had an APS-C size sensor, the lens would have to be gigantic. It would be a 9 to 12 pound camera. They just can't do it. That's why it hasn't been done. I've really tried to come up with just about every major important difference that I can with these cameras. It's possible. Maybe I omitted something, or maybe I got something wrong. It's possible. Feel free to write in the comments, but please don't yell. Be respectful and kind, and I will respond to you. I'm not perfect. Whatever camera you choose, it may sound trite, but being at the right place at the right time, getting that magical shot, and I think you all know what I'm talking about. As long as you're able to catch it, if you have a good eye and you can see something, any of these cameras can do a great job. And should you choose to purchase one, I also have some links as to where you can buy them. I get a small commission. It doesn't cost you anything. It just helps support the channel. And speaking of supporting the channel, please do subscribe and like. That also does help our growing channel. And well, I better put these cameras away or start using them, or I don't know what. Thanks so much for watching. I appreciate it, and we'll see you in the next one.